Okay, today is the Day of Atonement. And this is a very, very important holy day because of the main character that's involved in this is the high priest. There are things that he does. Now in Leviticus 16, that's the story of the Day of Atonement and how these things go. When that was written when the children of Israel were still in the desert. Well, in my presentation, what I'm going to be going through takes us to the Second Temple period time. So there might be a little difference in the way certain things were done because it was a different time. The information that I got my from is actually this book, The Holy Temple in Jerusalem by Rabbi Ariel. This is a detailed book, and you can only get it in one place from the Temple Institute in Jerusalem. And what it talks about is the detail of what the priesthood would be doing and in the ceremonies. Now, on the first night, on the night of Day of Atonement, there were a lot of activity going on in the temple. And it went on all night, and believe it or not, the high priest didn't get any sleep because he had a lot of nightly duties as well as the daylight duties. And one of the things that they were doing at night, he would review all the animal sacrifices. He would also teach laws of the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, to the priesthood and those that were there, because the temple was full. Sanhedrin was there and the priesthood. The high priest would take an oath to fulfill his duties properly. These are all these things that are taking place during the night. And it says the high priest studies the Torah on the Day of Atonement at night. There's certain things he's revealing. Now there were two very, very interesting things that I learned that I never realized. One of the duties was the appointment of a deputy high priest. And the reason you had this deputy high priest, if something would happen to the high priest where he would become unfit or unclean, this deputy high priest would step into his place. I didn't realize that before. And also there's the appointment of the priest who takes the goat to the wilderness. So this is all going on during the nighttime hours. All this behind the scene. And then, as you would the first slide, Dave, this is where the ceremonies begin. This is where you have, if you read in Leviticus 16, it's Aaron. Because this is when the children of Israel are still out in the desert. This is the Second Temple time period. So what you have taking place here is the high priest first confesses his sins over this bull. Then he does it again to confess the sins of the priesthood, which is his family. So this is where things begin, right here. Now, I want to step through the lots. The lots that were used to determine which goat was which. So I'm kind of just going through a brief thing what goes on behind the scenes. Next slide, Dave. What you have here is the actual box where the two lots are put in. And this box is just big enough for a hand to reach in, take one, and the other hand to take the other. The next slide, Dave. This one has the Lord's name on it. And the other one, of course, is for Azazel, where you can pronounce that a couple of different ways. So next slide, Dave. Now when the lot is drawn, it's put on the goat's head to make a determination of who's who. So we're going to go into this procedure, but I want you to kind of get an idea how these lots work. Next slide, Dave. Okay, what you have here, you've got the high priest here. This is the deputy high priest. He's the one that's bringing this box with the lots that are in it. This gentleman back here is the head of the family of the Levitical priesthood that is serving at that time. Now, these two gentlemen, they are very, very important positions. Next slide, Dave. Now this is the interesting part. As you can see, the lot's has been drawn. It's been taken out of the box. Then you see these two scarlet scarves. The thing that's interesting that takes place When the high priest puts his hand in the box, takes this lot and takes that, he cannot look at it. And there's a reason for that, because if the lot with the Lord's name on it is in the right hand, that is considered a good omen for Israel. He does not look at them. What happens in this is the deputy high priest, who is on his right side, will look at his hand to see, and then look at the other end to see where the lot is that has God's name on it. When he has done that, he goes, "Sir, high priest, raise your right hand." Well, that would mean that that lot with the Lord's name on it is in that right hand. If it were in the left hand, then he would say, "Sir, high priest, raise your left hand." And that's what designated which goat was which. Now what's interesting here, if you notice these scarlet sashes, once that was determined, who's who on these goats, the one that was for the sin offering, they would tie it around its neck. The one that was the one to Azazel, the one that would be out to the wilderness, they tied it around the horns. The reason they did that was not to confuse the goats, because there's a few more things that are taking place. So they did not want to get these goats mixed up. And that's how they signified it, by doing that. And then, okay, Dave, the next slide. Now here we have, as you can see, the sash is tied around the horns. This is where the high priest confesses the sins of the nation of Israel over this goat. This is your Azazel goat that's here. But there's interesting things that go on here, because if you notice what the people are doing here, because he would actually mention the name of God. And all who heard this, they would raise their hands and then prostrate themselves because of the holy name. And he actually said it. But then further reading what was going on is that these people that heard God's name, they started using it. So in future rituals of this, the high priest, he would say God's name very low, under his breath, to prevent this. Because God's name is so sacred that it's not to be used casually. It just isn't. But it's what's taking place here, and this is all in Leviticus 21. Next slide, please, Dave. Now this is an interesting part. Once the high priest will turn the goat over to the appointed priest who would take this goat into the wilderness. What's interesting about this is, if we look at, well, I'll be going into this following this. This is the banishment part of this, and what these people would do, they would actually kind of badger this goat, and they would reach up and yank some of his hair out. And that's why you start seeing a narrow path here, is to stop this. But what these people would be chanting out there would be, "Take our sins and leave. Go to the desert." I mean, they were harassing this goat. And that's the reason, because it's the sin. It's Azazel being taken out there. Okay, Dave, next slide. Now there's an interesting thing that goes on here. Because where this priest is hidden, it's at 12 kilometers away from the city, which is about 7.5 miles. Along this trek, there are what they call way stations. There's 10 of them. And what the way station was for was actually for this priest. If he should be coming faint or something, he needed water or to eat food, he was allowed to do that on the Day of Atonement as he went along to the wilderness where he was headed. The 10th way station was the one that actually witnessed what happened to the goat. So this is a ceremony, a ritual that goes on all the time. Next slide, Dave. Now this is, I found to be very interesting, because if you remember, in Leviticus 16, while the children of Israel are in the desert, they turned the goat loose in the wilderness. But the thing to remember, the intent was for this goat to die, was to cease to exist. Because as this one goat was turned out into the wilderness, he's either starved to death or something killed him, but there were desert people out there. And there are written accounts where these desert people would capture this goat and consume it. So it's a death sentence for this goat. But during the Second Temple period, they went up on a cliff. But there's an interesting thing that happens here, because if you remember that crimson sash, this priest would half it. And he would tie it onto a boulder, and it would literally turn white, which meant Israel's sins were forgiven. Then there was a very specific way that, as you can see here, the way this goat, and then it was shoved over the cliff. And as he shoved them, he said, "May the sins of your people of Israel be thus smashed." Because as this goat tumbled down the cliff, he would hit things. Most of the time, the goats did not survive. But then there are written accounts of where the goat survived. And what the goat would do, of course, would be to wander off into the desert, to either die or be captured by desert people and consumed. But it's the method, because you kind of, when I was young in the church, I kind of had this idea, okay, this goat gets turned out into the wilderness, okay? He can survive. But that's not the intent. The intent is for this goat to cease to exist. Now, as I look at all of this, this pictures something very, very important for us. It's a foreshadow of something that's going to take place in the future. And Dave, would you go to the next slide, please? Now, we're back into Revelations, because now we're dealing directly with Satan, who is totally responsible for the knowledge that Adam and Eve accepted, which was sin. And it's been our plague for the last 6,000 plus years. But as Revelation 23 reads, it says, "The angel threw him into the bottomless pit, which he then shut and locked, so Satan could not deceive the nations anymore until the 1,000 years were finished. Afterwards, he must be released a little while." Now, if you remember back in that one slide I had where the goat was being led away, that's banishment. That's on the way to his end. But that's a phase, and Revelation 23 is a banishment phase. The first part. And as we go to Revelation 27, it says, "And when the 1,000 years came to an end, Satan will be let loose out of his prison." We understand this, okay? He's been bound, so now he has this opportunity, which he does. And on to verse 8, it says, "He will go out to deceive the nations, called Gog and Magog. In every corner of the earth, he will gather them together for battle. A mighty army as numberless as sands along the seashore." Now this has always been something that has struck me as curious, because here we go through a millennium of peace and prosperity. And yet Satan manages to deceive this huge number. I mean, that's something to think about. How can this happen? Are these people or ones that really didn't want this peace and prosperity? Who are they? They obviously were easily deceived into forming this army, thinking that they're going to surround Jerusalem, thinking they can conquer Jerusalem. Of course, we understand this is Satan's motive. This is his hatred to destroy God's plan and whatever God is doing, which is kind of speaks for itself. And then in Revelation verse 9, it says, "I saw them as they went up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded God's people and the beloved city. But fire from heaven came down on the attacking armies and consume them. So this is God's intervention. He destroys this army. And you sit there and think, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, in other words, what was going through their mind when they see this army coming their way? I mean, I've been in the military, and there's several in here as well, and when you're on a front line, your enemy's coming, it gets your attention. But it's interesting to see this, because this was a huge army that's surrounding the city. I'm a little tongue-tied, the mouth's a little dry. But, and then they see this fire come down and destroy them. Whew. Feel good about that. So I want to go to verse 10, because this one, there's some interesting things about this verse. Because it says, then the devil, who had deceived them, was thrown into the fiery lake of burning sulfur, joining the beast and false prophet. There they were tormented day and night forever and ever. Well, now you got to stop and think about something here. The false prophet and the beast are flesh. They're mortal beings. Correct? They would be destroyed in this burning lake of fire. Yes, their remains are there, whatever, ashes or whatever you call it. But now we come to this question of Satan himself, the devil. Now with a little research, because this is always, for years, I've always struggled with this forever and ever. Well, if you look forever and ever, the Greek term can and is translated forever to the end. There's an end it's talking about here. It doesn't go on forever and ever. And this was something I tried to understand for years, because I'm trying to figure out, how can this be? Why would God torment someone forever and ever when he no longer has any use for him? He's guilty of a crime. It's a crime that is punishable by death. But looking at it further, it says, this comes out of Matthew 8:29. Have you come to torment us before the time? And time in the Greek is eon. It means a certain amount of time, a long period of time. It's still talking about an end. This is where the demons got into the swines and so forth. And this is their comment back to Christ. And it said, now torment can mean to be held accountable or guilty. Because when you read, let's turn there, Matthew 8:29. Because it cleared up a lot. And it says, these are the demons that are speaking. It says, what do you want with us, Son of God? They shouted. Have you come here to torment us before what? The appointed time. There's a time of judgment. And we understand this. There's a judgment period for these angels, as well as Satan. Because does it not say somewhere in the New Testament that we would also judge angels? There is an end to these things. Next one, please, Dave. Now, I want to go through these verses. There's a couple of them, because I want you to understand who this is. God is telling you who this is. And it's very important that you understand and know that. It says, beginning in Ezekiel 28, verse 13, you were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering, the sardonyx, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, turquoise, emerald with gold. The workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared for you on the day you were created. Satan is a created being. And I know there's been some teachings where they talk about he can't be destroyed. Well, I totally disagree with that. He's a created being. God's not going to create something that's greater than he is. He can destroy his creation. He's told us that. Satan is a created being. Let's go to verses 14 and 15. It says, I ordained and appointed you as the mighty angelic guardian. You had access to the holy mountain of God and walked along the stones of fire. You were blameless in all you did from the day you were created until the day evil was found in you. This is a part of the Day of Atonement. This is part of the teachings, part of the understanding. These two goats. And God is going to be saying something very, very important here. Let's go to verse 18. You defiled your sanctuaries with your many sins and your dishonest trade. So I brought fire out from within you, and it consumes you. I reduce you to ashes on the ground in the sight of all who were watching. What is that saying to you? It speaks clearly to me because in verse 19, it makes it clear. All who knew you are appalled at your fate. You have come to a terrible end. You will exist no more. Does that not tie in with that goat that got tossed off that cliff? He exists no more. This is Satan's fate. The day will come where he will exist no more. But I have to ask this question where it says, all who knew you. You know, and in 18 it says, on the ground in sight of all who were watching. Who are these people? Let's take a moment and think. Who are we? We know who he is. Those of us that are changed, go through the millennium, do you not think that you would also be watching this terrible end? That you would be there as a witness? I strongly believe that. And of course there will be others. We don't know the exact time when God's going to destroy him. But it's obvious we will see it. Now this is just one of the many things about the Day of Atonement. There are so many things that are going on. And I think about Chuck's sermon, where that's a very good point, where he's talking about this at-one-ment with God. And that's what we pursue, but there's so many other things that are taking place also through these ceremonies. And of course, you know, in Leviticus, it doesn't go into all the details, what was happening during the night, but it goes into what happens during the day. But it's very important what it tells us. Our tormentor, the one that has led us down this dark path, and I'm talking about Satan, he's judged. When Christ was crucified, he was judged, and he was also sentenced. That sentence not only meant being removed from the throne and it given to Christ, it's also a death sentence. And I think God is very clear in this. Because our God is a merciful God. Those that perish in the lake of fire, along with Satan, these are acts of mercy. He's bringing their miserable existence and their life to an end. That's our God. That's how merciful he is. He is not a tormentor forever and ever and ever. He is not. And on this Day of Atonement, this is something we should be very, very thankful to know and understand. Justice will be done. And the author of sin is coming to an end.